Thank you for bringing me out here from the Phoenix, Arizona desert, reminding me that green is not just theoretical, but an actual color that exists in real life. It's always nice to be reminded of that. I am an attorney, as was mentioned, and that means, of course, that 1 o'clock is also theoretical. And so I will try to keep an eye on the clock and make sure that I keep my remarks brief and interesting. I'd like to tell you the story about Right to Try and how it came to be, and then after that I would love to take your questions. So be thinking throughout the presentation if there's anything that you want to talk about, and let's have a conversation. I'll make sure to leave time for that. Well, you know, I want to start out by sort of giving you a story about a patient that, that really inspired us to write and pass Right to Try. His name is Diego Morris. Now, Diego was 10 years old when he was told by his doctor that he was going to die. That day had started out just like any other. He got ready for school and he put his soccer ball in his backpack because Diego was going to be a star soccer player. He was only 10 years old, but he was well on his way to trying out for the Olympic team. And the only difference about that morning is that Diego's leg hurt just a little bit. And his mother kind of wrote it off. She said, you know, he's rough and tumble and he plays soccer and he probably just banged it or somebody probably kicked him. And it didn't get better, though. And the thing is, it hurt more. And Diego wasn't a complainer, and he was complaining about his leg. And so his mom said, all right, we're going to take him into the doctor, and we'll figure out what's going on. So Diego went to the doctor, and they ran lots and lots of tests. And then the doctor called Diego's parents in to give them some news. And Paulina, Diego's mom, thought, well, what kind of news could require both parents? My son is 10 years old. What could possibly be wrong? And that day, Diego's doctor gave Diego's parents the news that no parent should ever have to hear. He was diagnosed with osteosarcoma. It's a rare form of bone cancer, and it is fatal in about 1/3 of the people that it affects. The doctor told Diego's mother that he was unlikely to do very well after chemotherapy treatment, and then he left it at that. Now, Diego's mother, Paulina, has become a good friend of mine, and she wasn't taking that as the end of the story. And she said, okay, well, he's 10 years old, and what treatments are there? What can we do? And of course, the doctor said, well, there's chemotherapy, and we will give him chemotherapy treatment, but after that, it's quite possible, in fact, probable, that the disease will come back, and it will come back worse. And Diego's mother said, okay, well, what else? And what else can we do? And the doctor said, well, there is a treatment that has been proven to be quite effective. It's helped a lot of people in Europe. It's helped a lot of people in Israel, in Mexico. And Paulina said, well, great, let's try that. And the doctor said, well, unfortunately, that drug is not approved here by the United States Food and Drug Administration in the United States. You cannot get that medication. Now, we can ask for special permission from the FDA to give you that medication, but approval takes quite a long time. I have to fill out hundreds of hours of paperwork, and then the FDA has to go through a couple committees, and then finally they'll tell us what the decision is. And the problem is this treatment is only really effective if it's given after chemotherapy, right after. Diego just simply does not have the time. Well, Paulina had to make a difficult decision at that point. She had to take Diego, who was 10 years old, away from his school, away from his friends and his family and his entire support system. And the family picked up and not only traveled, but moved to England in order for Diego to get these treatments. Now, I'm happy to say that Diego's story has a good ending. Diego's treatments were successful. He's now cancer-free. And in fact, he interned at the Goldwater Institute last summer. He told me that although he's still holding out to be a star soccer player, he wants to work in public policy, and he wanted to help us pass Right to Try laws, which we're going to talk about today, in order to help other people that might not have the financial means that he had to pick up and go to another country to get life-saving treatments. Now, there is a sad part of this story still, and that is that the drug that helped Diego was approved in Europe in 2009. It's now 2016, and that drug is still not lawful here in the United States. Now, the FDA will tell you, look, there are other options. It's not like while the drug is making its way through our process that you have absolutely no options for treatment. You can participate in a clinical trial study. That's how the FDA does business, and you know, it's the scientific gold standard, right? When we test whether or not a drug is going to be safe or effective, when we see what kind of side effects it might have, when we determine what the proper dosage is, we put it through a clinical trial process. It's roughly a 3-part system, and it, as mentioned, can take over a decade. It usually takes about 15 years. While it's going through the system, you can volunteer to participate in that experiment, and then you can get access to the medication. Well, it's true, that is a way into the system before the drug is fully approved, but only about 3% of the sickest patients are accepted into clinical trials in the United States. The other 97% are out of luck. And of course, usually the sicker patients, ironically, are the ones that don't get into the clinical trials. It's the patients that are more robust, that can be studied, that are the ones that are allowed into the clinical trials. So we have a friend at the Goldwater Institute named Ted Harada. In fact, a lot of his friends call him Lazarus. Why is that? Well, that's because he has Lou Gehrig's disease, or something that is commonly known as ALS. And you all know that if you know anything about Lou Gehrig's disease, you know that it is 100% fatal. And it is very debilitating. But Ted was lucky. Ted, in fact, is an amazing story because 5 years ago, Ted was enrolled in a clinical trial. He was wheelchair bound at the time, and he is now participating in 5K races in just 5 years. Unbelievable. He may be the first person to be, now we don't like to use the C word, the cure word, right? But he may be the first person who's been cured of ALS. Well, there were 32 other people that were in his clinical trial, and there have still only been 32 people who have been allowed into that clinical trial. In the 5 years since Ted got that medication and got better, 24,000 people have passed away from ALS. 24,000 people. Again, only 3% of the sickest people make it into these trials. And like I said, the sickest people, it's more difficult for them to get into clinical trials than well people. Let me tell you what is the reality of this system. Jen McNary is the mother of 2 boys, Austin and Max. Both of them have Duchenne muscular dystrophy, another debilitating disease where the muscle structure breaks down and you're unable to walk and unable to do basic tasks for yourself, and then eventually it is fatal. So Jen took her boys to a clinical trial because there was a very promising medication that was slowing and maybe even reversing some of the effects of Duchenne's. This is groundbreaking medication. So she took Austin and Max. Austin was 14, Max was 11, to the trial. And in that trial, the FDA wanted the company to test whether or not the medicine would be effective in ambulatory boys. So in other words, people who were still able to walk. Now, the 11-year-old was still able to walk. The effects of the disease were not as prominent in him, but her 14-year-old at that point was already having difficulty walking on his own. And so Jen McNary was faced with a horrific situation when one of her sons was allowed into the clinical trial, but not the other. And she had to watch as one of her sons got better, was actually able to get up and run and play with his friends, while her other son got so bad that he could no longer dress or feed himself. Her 11-year-old boy was helping her 14-year-old get ready. That is the reality of the situation that the FDA has set up for us. Now, why is this? Why is it that in a country that values freedom so much, that your freedoms are so protected, that is how we are able to be entrepreneurial and develop some of these cutting-edge treatments right here in our country? Why is it that in that country we are not free to be able to take those medications, to be able to make decisions for ourselves? Well, again, that's because under the FDA's current drug approval system, it can take a decade, sometimes 15 years, and $1 billion for promising life-saving investigations to make their way to market approval. A decade and $1 billion. If you were to look at your cell phone, which I know none of you are because you're captivated by every word that I'm saying, but if you were looking at your cell phone, you know, consider how old it is. Mine's what, a year old maybe? After 2 years, the things don't work anymore, right? Can you imagine walking around with a 10-year-old cell phone in your pocket? You just wouldn't stand for that. It wouldn't work. But yet that is what the FDA is forcing patients to do. I know there's a few people laughing. You probably have a 10-year-old cell phone, right? Oh, look at that. There's one of those flip phones. Somebody's going to pull out a car phone now, right? One of those briefcase phones. Yeah. Always has to be one to ruin the analogy. But anyway, you know, most of you don't walk around with a 10-year-old cell phone in your pocket, and that is what the FDA is asking terminal patients to do, is to rely on 10, 15-year-old technology while new cutting-edge medications are stuck in bureaucratic red tape. Dying patients just don't have that type of time to wait. But also, there's really a deeper reason at issue here, right? Because in the United States, if you want to take any type of medication, you have to ask permission from the government to be able to do so. Now, you might think, well, I can go down to the Rite Aid and I can get some Tylenol and I don't have to ask the government's permission for that, but that's only because the government has said that you can do that. It's approved Tylenol so that you don't have to go and get special permission first. And as you know, some medications you do have to sign something and show somebody your ID in order to be able to get the medication. Well, when you're terminal, you have to fill out hundreds of hours worth of paperwork with your doctor and beg, literally beg the government for an exception to be able to try medication that could save your life. That is the situation in the United States today. And at the Goldwater Institute, we think that that is not something that we should have to put up with. If you look back to first principles, which we all do, we're freedom-loving people, we look at the Constitution, we look at the Declaration of Independence, our country was founded on the first principle that you own your own life. And then, if you own your own life, the right to medical autonomy, the right to make your own medical decisions is fundamental. It's got to be one of the most fundamental, if not the most fundamental right. And so, government regulations that tell you that you can't make that decision are not only immoral, but I would argue unconstitutional. If we have a right to life, if we have a right to liberty, then we ought to be able to have a right to medical autonomy, especially when we are dying of a terminal disease and there is a medication out there that could potentially save us. Now, this is something that many people have argued for decades at the federal level, and with just a little bit of success, but mostly their concerns have gone unaddressed. One of those men was Frank Burroughs. Some of you might have heard of him. His daughter was named Abigail. She was also diagnosed with cancer, and there was a promising medication that was making its way through clinical trials. But see, she had a different kind of cancer, and studies had shown that this particular medication that was being tested for one kind of cancer could potentially be helpful for her type of cancer. It could have saved her life. But that she wasn't allowed to get into the clinical trial because she wouldn't have benefited that particular study, that particular experiment. And so her father went to court to fight for her right to be able to make that decision in conjunction with her doctors. Now, I'm sorry to say that Abigail passed away while her father was fighting for her right to try to save her life. But he formed the Abigail Alliance, a fantastic group that does very, very good work at the federal level, and you should all check them out. And he took the fight all the way to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Those of you who are lawyers in the room know that that's the second highest court in the land. And he argued, quite simply, that Abigail, who was dying, should have the right to decide with her doctors, if all government-approved options weren't going to work for her, that she should be able to take a medicine that was showing great promise. She should be able to have the right to try to save her life. And what did the D.C. Circuit say? A 3-judge panel said, yes, absolutely. The Constitution protects your right to try to save your life when you are terminal and a drug is deemed safe, but still going through testing for efficacy. You can make that decision to try to save your life. That was a great, great decision. That was overruled a year later when the FDA petitioned for a rehearing by that same circuit. So if you don't like the first decision that comes out of a court of appeals, you can ask the full court, all the judges that sit on that Court of Appeals at the federal level, to rehear the case and make a decision, and that's exactly what the FDA did. And the full court, the en banc panel in the D.C. Circuit said, well, actually not so fast. Now, you don't really have a fundamental right to try to save your life with unapproved investigational medications. What you have is a liberty interest. Well, that's a distinction only a lawyer could love, right? What the heck does it mean to have a liberty interest? Well, this is the term that courts use when they want to talk about rights that really are second-class rights, right? A free speech right is treated by courts today as a first-class right. And if government wants to infringe upon or regulate your right to free speech, the government has to go to court and prove that it has a darn good reason for doing so, and that that reason has something to do with public health, public safety, public welfare. Only then can the government infringe on your right to free speech. But if it's a right like, say, the right to earn an honest living, or the right to own and use your property as you see fit, or, according to the DC Circuit, the right to try to save your own life when you've exhausted all other government-approved options, well, then it's just a liberty interest. And in that case, that means that the courts will defer to legislative judgment. So that's what the court did in the Abigail Alliance decision in 2007. The DC Circuit said, you know, Congress and the FDA has determined that it's best these drugs make their way through this lengthy system, and that we just make case-by-case decisions on whether people should be able to try those medications, and this system is working according to the FDA, and that's the system that we're going to keep in place, and who are we as judges to second-guess the legislature? There was an interesting piece of that decision, though, because the court said, if the people really want to protect this right, what they should do is they should go to their legislators, and they should make that change through the democratic process, that lawmakers and policymakers and patients and parents and doctors should go to the democratic process, should go to their capitals, and they should make a difference that way. Now, as an attorney who works in the courts to defend freedoms, I think that that was a mistake, to say the least. I think that a judge's job is to uphold the Constitution, is to protect your rights, and if a law is on the books that violates your rights, then it is that judge's job not to go like this and tell the legislature that it can make whatever decisions it wants and it will rubber stamp those legislative decisions, but it is that judge's duty to stand up and strike down that law if it violates your rights. Nevertheless, at the Goldwater Institute, we took that part of the decision as a call to action, and as we started talking to patients like Diego, like Jen McNary's boys, we started learning about these situations, we said, you know what? Washington isn't the place to get this done, because great groups like the Abigail Alliance have been working in Washington, D.C. for decades, and nothing has changed. It's business as usual in the Beltway. So what we ought to do is go to the states, and that's what we did. We devised just a couple years ago laws called right to try laws. What are right to try laws? Well, they're just that. They protect your right to try to save your own life with medications that have passed basic FDA safety testing and are still working their way through the process for efficacy and dosage and side effects. If all government-approved options have been determined not to work for you, and your doctor sees a promising medicine out there that might save your life, he can write you a prescription for that medicine, and you have the right to try it. It's as simple as that. That's what right to try laws do. Now, in my mind, they're also quite equitable, because the FDA, remember, if the drug has passed phase 1 of the FDA safety testing, then the FDA has already said that this drug is safe for human testing while we determine what the side effects might be. And so this is just an equitable law that extends to patients that aren't lucky enough to get into clinical trials, that 97%. It extends to them the same rights as the patients who have volunteered to participate in the science experiment. And, of course, dying patients face a different calculus, right? This is not acne cream for teenage boys. In that situation, we might say, well, the drug might be safe, but it might have all sorts of horrible side effects that might be a lot worse than the acne that you're faced with every single day. So we might want to learn a little bit more about this drug before we decide that you can take it. These are patients that have been told that they're going to die. And so for them, if the drug isn't going to kill them and their disease will, they should be able to work with their doctors and make a decision about whether or not they're willing to take some risks, not knowing about what potential side effects could be of that medication. Now, I'm happy to report, actually it's time to update my bio, because I'm happy to report that Right to Try has actually passed into law in 26 states since it was written just a couple of years ago. 26 states, that means over half. North Carolina happens to be one of those states who all passed it last legislative session. It's also sitting on the governor's desk in Georgia, and it's going to continue working its way through other states. It's running in about 18 other states this session alone. Now, these laws are passing with bipartisan, near unanimous support through legislatures, because for a lot of people at the state level, it's just a no-brainer. In fact, the only state to have considered a right to try law and vetoed it was the state of California, believe it or not, which is very unfortunate because that state holds about 10% of the United States population. Now, why did the state of California veto the legislation? It was actually introduced and sponsored by a very progressive Democrat because, again, this is not a partisan issue. It's not about politics. It's about people and principles. It passed near unanimously through the legislature, bipartisan support, got on the governor's desk. Now, a week before, Governor Jerry Brown was presented with a right to die law. That law says that if you're terminal and out of options, you can choose with your doctor to end your own life instead of continuing to suffer. And Jerry Brown signed that into law. He said, you know, if I were faced with this type of decision, I would not want, I would want that choice, and I wouldn't want to take that choice away from anybody else. Okay, great. 1 week later, he vetoed right to try. And he said it was because we ought to give the federal system a little bit longer to work. A little bit longer. Dying patients have been waiting decades for the federal system to work. It is broken. It's time to change it. I'm happy to say that the sponsor of the California legislation has reintroduced the law in California. It's still making its way through the process, and they're going to put it right back on Governor Jerry Brown's desk and tell him that he ought to sign it because he is now in the minority, as 26 other states, blue states, red states, and everything in between have passed this law. Now, for any of you who are lawyers in the room, you might be wondering, okay, this sounds great, but how the heck do you do this at the state level, right? Because it's the FDA that says you can't take these medications. Federal law trumps state law. Is this some kind of wacky nullification idea? How are you all getting this done, right? Well, what we're doing is we're using the tools that our founding fathers gave us. James Madison in Federalist 51 said that we've created a federalist system. We've created a dual system of federal and state governments in order to provide a dual level of security for the rights of the people, so that when the federal government fails to protect your rights, as I argue it has done, and it has done egregiously here with the right to try, then the states can step in with their constitutions or their state laws and protect those rights for you. So, in other words, the federal constitution serves as a floor for the protection of rights. It does not serve as a ceiling. And states often do protect rights to a greater extent than the federal government. In fact, almost every single state has a very broad, positive free speech clause in its constitution. We all know, I know you all have your pocket constitutions with you, or you have your iPhone app. And if you look at the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, right? Well, most of your state constitutions give a positive right to free speech. They say that everybody has the right to speak freely as long as they're responsible for that right. And courts at the state level, as well as the federal level, has interpreted that to be much broader than the federal protections. So too with right to try. Now, the Supreme Court actually has some pretty strong precedent for this. The Supreme Court has never considered the issue of right to try. The Abigail Alliance decision that I told you about earlier never made its way to the Supreme Court. And so that decision is only effective in the DC Circuit jurisdiction. But if the Supreme Court were ever to consider the issue of right to try, I think it would come out in our favor. There are many examples of the Supreme Court in recent years deferring to federalism when it involves the protection of rights, and probably one of the most important ones is the case of Gonzalez versus Oregon. We were just talking about right to die. This is a case where the voters in Oregon passed a right to die law in their state, a physician-assisted suicide law, even though it conflicted with what the federal attorney general said was lawful in this country. And they went to court, and the United States Supreme Court says that states can use their constitutional powers to protect people's right to die, to protect people's right to choose physician-assisted suicide if they want. They don't have to, but the states can do that. Well, if states can protect your right to die, they can certainly protect your right to try to save your own life. And that's what we're doing here. So really, when it comes down to it, we're not only changing laws, but we're trying to change the culture. To this day, the FDA remains one of the most popular federal agencies. And the FDA used to do a lot of good. When the FDA was born in the 20th century, its purpose was to empower patients. Right? Its purpose was to make sure that you and your doctor had all the information necessary to be able to make educated decisions, and that people weren't trying to defraud you. Now, flash forward, and what is the FDA doing? It's not intentional probably, but what the FDA is doing is it's putting up barriers to patient autonomy, and it's saying that government knows best and that government is going to practice medicine rather than your doctor and rather than individuals. And that's what's happening today. Well, the importance of medical autonomy in this country ought to be fundamental. It is fundamental, and we are passing right to try laws nationwide in order to make sure that that fundamental right is preserved. So before I take your questions, I'd urge you all to visit righttotry.org. It's our special dedicated website for the right to try issue. Again, I mentioned North Carolina is a right to try state, but the problem is we need to get the word out. If you know someone who's in the unfortunate situation where they've been diagnosed with a terminal illness and there are no government approved options that are available to them, please encourage them to talk to their doctor about right to try. The Goldwater Institute can and will be a resource for right to try, and you can always contact us. What we really need to do is change hearts and minds and to change the way that people look at the regulatory culture, because when you're fighting for your life, you shouldn't have to fight the government too. So thank you very much for your time today, and I'd be happy to take any of your questions.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.